With Season of the Witch, Bungie reprised another one of Destiny 1's classic raids. This time, we got Crota's End. When Vault of Glass and King's Fall were remastered in the last 2 years, the music in those raids was almost entirely the same as in the original. However, the same is not true for Crota's End, as almost every single encounter has had major changes made to their music. In today's video, I want to go over all of those changes, and why they significantly improved the raid experience. Upon first flying in, the track that you'll hear is a short preview of what's to come. The fly-in animation plays Soul of Crota, which is a track that we'll be coming back to later. After that, a short cutscene is shown which looks down into the Hellmouth and shows your fire team transmatting onto the surface of the moon. This cutscene plays a short segment of Into the Pit, which is also a track we'll be coming back to later. Afterwards, things are more or less the same as they were in Destiny 1 for the opening and the first encounter. You hear the tension variant of The Fallen when building the opening bridge, which is a little bit of an odd choice for a Hive raid, but the oddness doesn't end there, as the music that plays during the descent into the Hellmouth is actually the percussion from the Fallen Walker public event from Destiny 1. Unlike in Destiny 1 though, Crota's End definitely isn't a public event anymore. Once down in the Abyss, the first encounter starts, which is mostly filled with decently quiet Deathsinger screams for most of the encounter, but once you start building the final bridge out of the arena, just like in Destiny 1, you get to hear the World's Grave, which still fits the encounter very well. It's your usual chaotic Hive rave music that the Hive are still so famous for almost an entire decade later, and tracks like The World's Grave is where that all started. The first encounter is then capped off by Will of Crota once the bridge is completed. This is an unreleased track from Destiny 1 that was most notably featured in the Omnigul strike called Will of Crota, and then that became the Disgraced strike in Destiny 2 when the Cosmodrome was unvaulted. The path is then finally open for you to exit the Abyss and enter the Oversoul Throne. The Oversoul Throne is where you start the second encounter, the bridge. The first major change from Destiny 1 comes in with this encounter. When the encounter starts, a quiet piece of music starts playing without any percussion. But once the second sword has been dunked on the other side of the chasm, the percussion kicks in, and suddenly, this may be sounding a lot more familiar to those who played the original Crota's End. This is actually the same track that plays in the original Crota fight when someone is not currently holding the sword. This track originates from a Destiny 1 vanilla campaign mission on the moon, and it was sadly never officially released. For the original Crota fight, this was then mixed up with Into the Pit, which the music would transition to whenever someone picked up the sword. This became known as the iconic Swordbearer theme. However, since Into the Pit was originally composed slower and in a different key, they sped it up and changed the key to make sure that it properly fit together with the other percussion track, which is why when you listen to Into the Pit on the soundtrack, it may sound a little bit different from what you're used to in-game. In fact, the only place where you can hear Into the Pit in the original key and tempo that it was written in is in the Dark Below reveal trailer that Bungie posted back in 2014, the opening cutscene of Destiny 2's Crota's End that we talked about earlier, and a very short cue when you finish this encounter, the bridge. Here's what the two different versions sound like. Once the bridge encounter ends, and the Into the Pit queue has finished, you'll hear an assortment of Hive trademarked Deathsinger screams that you hear in basically every piece of Hive content these days. On top of that, You'll hear some of the usual Hive spooky noises, and those continue playing until your team starts the third encounter, Ir-Yût. Ir-Yût has one of the bigger changes in the entire raid. Instead of playing the music from the Will of Crota strike like it did in Destiny 1, this encounter is now fully scored with arguably the most iconic Hive track in the franchise, Temple of Crota. This track was released with Destiny 1 and appeared in the vanilla campaign. Since then, basically every single Hive-related expansion or season has had numerous references to the iconic synth motif established in Temple of Crota. The track itself has also been reused numerous times, with some examples being the Crota fight in Dares of Eternity, and a slightly remixed version which added more guitars for the Nightmare of Crota fight at the end of the Shadowkeep campaign. There's a little bit more nuance added to the encounter script though. For reference, the encounter script is basically a set of instructions that the music needs to follow based on what's currently happening in-game. Think of damage phase cues that play when every modern raid boss becomes damageable. Ir-Yût has something a little bit different though. Instead of continuing to play Temple of Crota normally, it will start playing the Will of Crota version of the track whenever the Dark Liturgy wipe mechanic starts. This version is mostly unreleased and very overused, but very few players will actually hear it in this encounter. That is because this cue only lasts until the damage phase starts, which means that if the wizards are killed roughly at the same time, this trigger doesn't even have a chance to play. Once all the Shield Singers have been defeated and Ir-Yût becomes vulnerable, Temple of Crota continues playing from a specific damage phase cue, and after that, the track starts looping entirely for Phase 2 and Phase 3 with no additional instructions. I have to say, Temple of Crota fits this encounter so incredibly well, especially on contest mode. The high density of yellow bar enemies swarming the summoning crystal from every direction, the timer that your entire team is constantly under, the chalice that people need to keep track of, and the damage check all result in a very chaotic fight, which Temple of Crota fits in very well. It's only a few short minutes that Ir-Yût needs to make sure that her song is the last thing you'll ever hear, and the only thing you can do to stop her is to move quickly and flawlessly. No other Hive track could have amplified that feeling more than Temple of Crota did here. Lastly, the big one, Crota himself. The music change in this encounter has sparked quite a lot of discussion on places like Reddit and Twitter because it's pretty significant. The original music of this encounter is almost entirely gone. The only thing of it that remains is the intro cue that plays once the encounter is started, the Oversoul Throne is restored, and Crota spawns, a little bit closer to you than last time. However, instead of playing the original percussion loop after that intro ends, which has now been moved to the bridge encounter, the encounter goes mostly quiet instead. That is, until someone picks up the very first sword. The track that starts playing is Soul of Crota, which you may remember was the very first track that you heard when you first flew into the raid. Soul of Crota starts playing in its ambient intensity, which is a first for raid bosses in Destiny history. If you want to know a bit more about what different intensity levels are, I've made a video talking about Neomuna's patrol music in which I go into a bit more detail into that. So if you want to know more about that, the link will be in the description below. This ambient intensity kicks in with an incredibly low and heavy brass. It's very foreboding in nature from the very start. Normally, in Destiny 1, this is where the iconic Swordbearer Q of Into the Pit would play for about 30 seconds, while the Guardian holding the sword deals damage to Crota. The reason why it likely doesn't play here anymore and they chose something else is because this first sword is only a small step on the path to defeating Crota. Normally, in Destiny 1, picking up the sword would be the penultimate step to defeating Crota, with the only thing left to do after that being to hit Crota with it and bring him down. It was the most heroic moment of the fight, so heroic music was chosen to mimic that action. In Destiny 2 though, it's a little different, because not only is the sword required to break Crota's shield so your weapons can deal damage, which is the exact opposite of Destiny 1, but also because a singular sword is not enough to bring him down. The music, staying in the ambient intensity and staying very foreboding, is conveying that same message, almost as if it's telling you, to defeat this Hive God, you're going to need more than that. However, when all necessary swords have been collected, you go up to Crota, strike him and bring him down to his knees, the action intensity kicks in, starting at a melody that D1 veterans will be very familiar with. That's right, it's the exact same melody as the original Swordbearer Q from Into the Pit. However, it's much older and more intense this time around. After the damage phase ends, the music permanently stays in that action intensity, conveying another message to you. If you can make it bleed, you can bring him down. Crota is no longer the only threat left in the room. You've become one too, and now it's your job to show that your fire team is a much bigger threat to Crota than Crota is to you. Once you reach the final stand threshold of Crota's health, instead of continuing to play the iconic melody, it transitions into the high-action version of Soul of Crota. All instruments kick in and play one final foreboding and threatening piece of music. This is Crota's final chance to have you and your fire team suffer the same fate as those who fell in the Great Disaster and those of the first Crota fire team. Despite all odds though, his final efforts are not enough, and the track ends in one final note as the Hive God falls. And with that, the Crota's End raid comes to a close, and we've made it to the end of the video. I personally loved every single change that they've made here. Temple of Crota and Soul of Crota specifically fit their respective boss fights so incredibly well, and have improved my experience with the raid so much compared to the original. I was a little disappointed when Crota's End was first announced, because it musically wasn't super interesting beyond that iconic 30-second cue when someone picks up that sword. And since they didn't really make any changes to Vault of Glass or King's Fall, I was personally really hoping for Wrath of the Machine, because the music in that raid is incredibly iconic for this franchise. And when Crota was announced, I was like, that means we're not going to get super interesting music for this raid. But they totally changed it up, and I massively respect the team for putting in the effort to get that done. It's absolutely fantastic what they've put together here, and that combined with the very fun reprisal of the encounter mechanics have made this raid one of my favorites in Destiny 2 currently. Let me know what your thoughts are on the music changes in the comments. I'd love to see what other people think about them. Anyway, that's it for the video. Thank you all so much for watching.